Hello, welcome back to Media Snack, live from New York.
And greetings from London.
I feel like I should make some kind of political reference. I was just thinking before the show, I should just kind of, because it's over here in America, it's kind of going bonkers. We've got a few weeks to go. But we're completely apolitical as ID Comms and as Media Snack. I won't do that. I might say, oh man, I might do that every now and again. So if you saw the debates last night, that was the reference to that. That's what it was.
Okay.
Right, this week, this is very interesting. So this is an area so close to our hearts. When we set ID Comms up over 10 years ago, and something which David and I and the team talk about a lot. And this is about the optimal relationship that a marketer should have with its agency. And that's a relationship which has kind of been strained over the last decade, right? We've documented this really over the last 5 years on Media Snack, how agency relationships have changed and evolved. Yeah. And those marketers watching who maintain agency relationships know that that's really difficult. And those of you running agencies know it's really difficult sometimes being an agency and having to, always try and, skate where the puck is going, as the Americans say. I've learned that. Try and anticipate the need and be really agile in adapting to changing marketer demand. Yeah. But the heart of it is a really good business relationship that needs to be built on trust and credibility. And it has to be optimized against obviously driving a business outcome. But it's so easier said than done, because it's about more than a contract. It has to be humanized. I think we've used that term before. And there's people that have to work together. And there are a good few people in the industry who we know are just really good at that and articulating what that means. And we're very lucky enough to have one of those joining us on the show today, which is Julie Chan, based in the US. Julie's worked through the pharmaceutical business, I think from J&J to Pfizer, and now more recently at
That's right.
GSK. Instrumental in designing those relationships. And just before we just bring Julie on, I mean, David, you have been on that side, right? You were media director at Nike and Coca-Cola. Yeah. So just quickly, what was your experience of trying to design and manage an agency relationship? How do you make it work?
Well, it's about the basics of a partnership, a really good partnership. You talked about trust. You talked about, trusting in the people that you work with every day, that their goals are aligned behind yours. And it's about establishing an environment and a process that enables the very best of the agency's talent to think about your challenges with the same level of investment, an emotive investment that you have. And when you get that right, you can create kind of magic, right? And we've been massive advocates of better client behavior to establish smarter, stronger agency client relationships. And that was one of the founding, blocks of ID Comms, as you rightly said. That was what we wanted to kind of bring out through our consulting practice. So to have Julie on, as you say, she's a brilliant practitioner of media, both from the client side, but also in managing relationships. So understanding what insights she can kind of share, I think is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, let's do it. And as usual, please leave comments and questions. We do stream live, and we can pick those up live. If you are a peer of Julie, work in media marketing, or you're running an agency, good opportunity to ask some questions here from somebody who really knows how to do this well. Hello, Julie.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. Speaking about a topic near and dear to my heart.
I know. Well, we're delighted to have you on, because it's something that we're just saying in the intro, has been a kind of passion of ours for 10 years. And as you know, David was on the marketer side at Coca-Cola and Nike. That would be a good collaboration, wouldn't it? And I was at the agency side, and so we kind of see where those pain points are. But a lot's changed in that decade, and Julie, you've seen a lot of that evolution and the tension that's existed between marketers and their agencies. Well, I'd like to start off by just going right back to the basics. Nobody is ever in a position to actually start from scratch, right? You're always picking up some kind of legacy. So this is a slightly strange fantasy world. But if you were to start from scratch, how do you start thinking about the structure of an agency? Like what's the start point to start sketching that out?
That's a great question, and in many regards, a loaded question, because you really have to do an internal look at yourself. Look at yourself in the mirror. Think about how you're structured. Would an agency relationship where the agency structure mirror yours really work? So, for example, I've seen a lot of instances where the client is a very locally P&L based organization with some central people. But the central people then go and build an agency scope that's extremely centrally led. So down the line, you could see how that is not going to work, and priorities and focuses are not aligned. So I always, go back to the basics. Take out a piece of paper, sketch out what your current organization looks like, where the priorities are, where the focuses are. Maybe think about where you want to be in the future. And then what support, what services do you need, and specifically where to support that? So for example, if not only do you have to layer on the global, regional, local, which is just obvious, but let's say you're a very data-driven company, or let's say you're a very e-commerce driven company or insights driven company. You need to make sure that the very foundational knowledge and staffing, and even things like where the personnel are based, really are set up for success to support you. We've seen so many instances where we have too many people in New York and London. And if you're building a global campaign that's meant to run in Shanghai or Bogota, are the people working on your business representative of who is going to receive this? So I think going back to the foundation, sketching out what your organization looks like, what you want it to look like a few years down the road, what needs to happen on the agency side to match that is where I'd start.
That's good. Yeah. Can I ask a quick question on that? Because we've had some discussion with various advertisers over the last few years, particularly on looking at the media operating model. I think we're not going to get into it today, but the in-housing discussion, like what should we do internally? What do we need agencies to do? There's been lots of thinking about the scope. But one of the frequent questions when we look at the internal media organization within the marketing org, and if you're a global advertiser or a multinational advertiser, big question is, should the media organization reflect the marketing organization? I don't know if you've had experiences of differences, because we find in some businesses, the marketing org can be quite global and quite centralized, potentially. It doesn't have to be, but it can be, and it can exist like that. It's very difficult to operate media solely globally, just because it's really a market, media is a marketplace, media really is a local or at the very least regional thing.
That's a great question. And at GSK, we are always thinking about the consumer first. So as a consumer, how are they going to consume your media? So I think the people closest to the action, the people closest to our consumer, is where all the smart thinking is going to happen and where it should happen. What also needs to happen is for central media teams to be closely aligned to marketing organizations, whether they're global, regional, or local, and really mirror and think about what each team's goals are and how we support them. So if you are a globally driven company with a big global marketing organization that's centrally driven, what are the priorities of that team? What are they trying to accomplish? Who owns the decision rights? Who owns the P&L? And where do the interdependencies and I guess boundaries exist between shared responsibilities or individual responsibilities? To me, a key first step is to really map that out and think about how it works on paper, but then how it works in practicality. Because we all know that on paper and in practicality, Sometimes they don't match. So let's think about, how do things really happen? Is there anything an organization should change before and during an agency relationship, because everything evolves, right? To really make sure you're delivering in market. Because at the end of the day, that's where our consumers are. That's where the purchase happens. That's where the action happens. But if there is no vision at a central level, then it's not going to translate down to a local level. So we have to make sure everything is in balance.
Julian, we're having a number of conversations at the moment with clients that are looking to kind of evolve their own internal operating models. Some of them are moving away from a very decentralized organization to gaining slightly more central control. And other clients are actually going the other way, and they're disentangling the sort of central teams to empower the local markets more. In those instances, do you think that changing an agency operating model at the same time is sensible, or would you suggest that, you know, for those advertisers, they get their own house in order, they get their own operating structures in place first, and once that is bedded in, do they then start looking at the external ones? So my question is, do you do it in parallel with your agencies at the same time, or is it sequential?
David, it's like the chicken and the egg, right? It's there's no right or wrong answer. And I'm laughing and I'm smiling because think about how things are so cyclical and how they ebb and flow. One day your company, we want to be very centrally driven. We must be globally driven. And then 4 years later, well, the action happens at the local level.
That's right.
So what I think people do not take the time to step back and think about the lessons learned. You know, what are the pros and cons of global? What are the pros and cons of local? You know, where does that in between step happen? Where are the intersections and where are the independent activities? It all depends on what your company goals are. And you would be you're hiring an agency because you want their people and their expertise and their experience. So to some extent, you would be a fool if you didn't hire the perfect partner who could help coach and grow with you.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you don't have your own philosophy within your DNA and within all employees' thinking, then, you know, it's like a land grab, right? It's you're making it up as you go along a little bit too much along the way. And that's where I think it's really important to take the time and figure out what the right scope of work is. You know, what is the right level of scope of work, and specifically what is in the scope of work. Because to my earlier point, if your scope of work doesn't match what your company and brand priorities are, and where you want to take the company and the brand, then you will have a misalignment on issues. And it just makes me think of some conversations we've been having recently during the pandemic. Unfortunately, during these hard recessionary times, we're being faced with things that we've never been faced with before. And guess what? They're not in your scope of work, right? So how do you deal with it? You can ignore it or you can confront it head on. I think the worst thing that could happen is you ask agencies for, you know, fire drill after fire drill, question after question, run yourselves around in circles with no clear answers. Whereas if you really step back and say, okay, where does this fit into the scope of work? You know, what item does it dovetail off of? Because generally it will be related to an item you've already defined. And try to be a little bit adaptive and fluid about it. And we use the word fluid a lot, and it's kind of nebulous. You know, what does it mean? But to me, I think it's really, you have to be nimble, you have to be agile these days, because if you're not, you're sunk. So in your agency relationships, I think it's important to figure out, you know, here's the base work, but there's going to be scenarios A, B, C, and D if 1, 2, and 3 happen, right? And we've all seen this during the pandemic, right? You know, they were panic buying, and then there was overstock, and then there was pantry loading, and, you know, cabinets were filled. So each one of those requires a different action. But if we drive our agencies crazy by constantly asking, you know, what if, nothing will get done. So when we talk about fluidity in a framework, I think there should be a base scope of work, a base framework of work to do, but some scenario planning off of that, just so everyone's on the same page and so everyone defines that fluidity in the same way.
Yeah, but that word fluidity, I think, is very appealing to the marketer, isn't it? Particularly in a year like this, and you want that. You want the flexibility in the scope. But agencies will find that maybe a quite uncomfortable word, fluidity, because that sounds like unpredictable and having to be, think very short term and reactive and all the kind of things which are potentially margin damaging, potentially for an agency leader. How do you? Because I know you maintain very good relationships with the agencies. What's the narrative then? How do you start that conversation? If there's a procurement leader or a marketing director listening to this, thinking that's what I need, I actually need to look at my scope. I need to build fluidity into it. How do you actually open that up with an agency that it doesn't sound painful?
Too scary. I think it's about having an honest conversation. You started the top of the broadcast saying it's all about trust and credibility. And to me, that comes with a clear and direct brief, right? And the hand-holding and willingness not to veer from that brief, to a crazy extent. But I really believe in over-communicating and written communication, written briefs, right? So everybody can have their point of view represented in the written brief. There's no misunderstanding, and there's a starting point. From there, obviously, there's a conversation on what if, scenario A, B, and C. And I think if teams really identify, we cannot have more than 5 different scenarios in item A in our workbook, then there's a level of understanding. At the end of the day, you have to remember the people who are writing your recommendations and coming up with ideas, they also need to pick up their kids from school. They need to buy milk, right? They need to get their flu shot. So we can ask and demand things of agencies all we want, but we're not going to get the best work unless we really are crystal clear in what we're asking, with time-bound deliverables and expectations, dialogue of what should come, and always thinking about what your mother told you. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. What do they need to do to be successful, and how can I, as a marketer, set up the team for success?
How do you maintain that consistent level of discipline and behavior within enormous kind of marketing global organizations? I see that as you're the front of house with the agency, you're delivering the right kind of narrative to the agency, but then within Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, GSK, there are multiple stakeholders regionally and at a local market level that have some form of imprint on media. How do you maintain those standards are withheld and adheld to that degree across all of your organizations? So there is a consistency.
You're being very polite there, David. Right? Wait. Like, there's some bad behaviors, aren't there?
There's some terrible behavior. And how do you maintain that? How do you make the behaviors strong?
It's not an easy task, and it goes back to being treated like the way you want to be treated. But it begins with internal alignment. Because if you don't have internal alignment on how clients should behave and interact with agencies and other marketers, other teams, then that's really not a good thing. And you're right, there is a lot of bad behavior, and you could give all the speeches you want in the world on, partnerships and how to work with agencies, but there is always going to be bad behavior. So I think you need to just address the bad behavior when it happens, address it swiftly and immediately, but then show people what good behavior looks like. Because I really believe it's the good behavior that gets the best results. If you're known as a marketer that agency folks, you here, go work on this. No, I'd rather quit than work on this. That's really not a good thing. And you hear tons of stories like that. You never want to be that terrible, terrible client.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from the top. It comes from your senior management. as they often are the front line, and they live that. We really look up to our CMO, for example. She lives that behavior. She acts that way. She treats agencies as partners. And so it sets a tone for the rest of the team on how we expect our people to treat our agency partners.
Yeah. And we've learned over the last 10 years, having been busy designing internal operating models and seeing how those things evolve, is how important those kind of softer areas are to define internally. And sometimes we come up against marketers who say, well, media is an optimization exercise. Why are you trying to write a vision for media? That sounds all kind of like fluffy. Like, what does that do? Does that, show me the CPM? But it's really important. We know that it's important to invest in that. And that's the headline for the internal structure in creating that culture of good behavior. I wanted to ask you, as we talk about structure, and you touched on some of the challenges of this year. I mean, we've seen a number of marketers, well, quite a lot, going into that, a lot of self-reflection this year, using some time. Maybe it was lockdown time, maybe it was after the chaos kind of died down a little bit, but thinking actually, what can we achieve in 2020? And actually looking at themselves a little bit and taking the opportunity to do that. Is that something you've been aware of? You've seen in other businesses or conversations that you've been having?
Yes, I think I've seen a lot of self-reflection, especially as it relates to COVID and the pandemic. I think people are asking themselves, does the current structure we have now live up to all the change that is happening, all the new consumer behavior? If you just think about e-commerce and the way consumer behavior and necessity has changed, how can our internal structure live up to that and grow exponentially beyond? So I think there's been a lot of soul searching in the last few months because of the pandemic, because of the economic times. And I think I think we have to evolve. There's an expression that I have been talking a lot about, being always helpful instead of always on. When we think about either campaigns or our staff being always on, or creative working in always on manner, search, etc. Always on is a term we use a ton in advertising, a ton in media. But I think about, what is always helpful versus what is sometimes helpful. And so to your question about looking in the mirror, reflecting, what type of structure, both internally and externally, is going to take us through the ups and downs and the unknowns of the pandemic, the ups and downs and unknowns of the economic recovery. And of course, that differs whatever country you're in, right? Some economic recovery is going to go a lot faster than others. But you must look at yourself in the mirror and must look at your own internal structure to say, is it working? How can it evolve? As you think about your corresponding agency structure evolving, I think it's an imperative.
Yeah.
What about? Can we just talk a little bit about culture? We've kind of teased out a little bit about internal culture and the importance of good behaviors within the client organization. How important, in your opinion, is agency culture? Now, you've worked with multiple agencies in your career. And they often come to us and say, how do clients view our agency culture? How important do you think it is to have a distinct agency culture as a client
I think
leader?
It's hugely important, right? Just like every brand stands for something, every agency stands for something, and culture is the foundation of our DNA. And if there is a mismatch in terms of culture, it's very difficult to work. But if there's a perfect marriage or a very good working relationship in terms of cultural fit, the dynamics of the relationship just work so much better. We talk a lot about creative bravery at GSK, but equally important, it's starting with the consumer, right? Living in the consumer's shoes, walking in the shoes. But at the end of the day, we have to sell product, right? That's kind of fundamental. So how do you marry all of that together with culture within the DNA of your company and the agency? I think it's important that the personnel on your business are very diverse teams, not only racially, age-wise, in every area of diversity. It's important to get all points of view on your agency teams. And especially when you're working in large, global, multinational companies, it's important to have every country, no matter how big or small, every diverse population represented. Because if we just produce one type of creative or have one type of media plan or one type of philosophy, we're not going to evolve and grow correspondingly with cultural trends, consumer trends, and the way of the world, the way we're going. So culture is hugely important as a foundation of a relationship.
It's good. I mean, loyal viewers of Media Snack will know we kind of sit on the fence a bit in that. I mean, we know that the company culture is so important, but yet we've also suggested that maybe historically, particularly media agencies, different maybe with creative agencies, maybe a bit more distinctive, but media agencies have been pretty vanilla over the years. And we say that as ex-agency and big advocates of agencies, but media agencies have found, I think, have been a bit bland and found it hard to differentiate. And maybe your personal experiences are with individuals and the performance of the agency. We look at them quite maybe a bit more generically. And we've maybe provocatively suggested that maybe you don't need media agency brand, because it's really just the buying exercise, if you like. Who cares what the brand is? The planning and the consultative part, the value-added stuff, potentially could sit in the creative agency brands. That was our kind of hypothesis with the future of holding companies. So kind of wondered what the point of media agency brands was. That's a different show, Julie. I'm not going to push you on that.
I do want to make one comment, though, on that, if you don't mind. I think, the age-old saying a great idea can come from anybody still holds true. A great idea can come from anybody. And in this day of rapidly changing evolution of data, of digital, of how consumers are behaving, when you think about the younger generation, I think, honestly, we're going to go back, we're going to ebb and flow, where media agencies hold the power in terms of ideas. Because think about where an idea comes from, right? It comes from data, it comes from insight, it comes from anywhere. And media agencies have a ton of data and are kind of the conduit to creative houses, to production houses, to all sites, publishers, and have their finger on the pulse of a lot of going on. So I think times ebb and flow, and nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows what will happen, but let's not cut short the media agency. I think they have a big role to play.
Good.
Or not only in terms of CPM and efficiency, which is the wrong attitude. And I mean, let's face it, that's a foundation of what media agencies do. But there's so much more creativity to be intertwined into that. Let's not underestimate that.
Good. Well said. Well said. Just one other question I had. You referenced a CMO, and you have a very high profile, well known and respected CMO at GSK. I just wonder what your perspective is over the years working. You haven't been exclusively in media roles, but you've been very involved in media. Just what your view is of the over the last decade, say the CMO's attitude to media. How have you seen that change, or not?
I think more and more CMOs are intricately involved and bigger supporters of media. We all know that media is typically the biggest line item on any P&L, and there are so many things that media drives, right? If you think about the consumer first, the foundation of walking in consumer shoes, CMOs need to get much closer to media for all of those reasons. But I think on one hand, everyone has an opinion about media. Everyone is a consumer of media, so it's very natural and easy to talk about. But if you think about the strategic contribution of media from a CMO's point, it's the key lever. And we've seen, our CMO, Tamara, many CMOs are not only 100% supportive and champions, but if you look throughout the industry, that's what people talk about, right? If you listen to CMOs talk, it's all about not only efficient and effective spending, but getting in at the very foundation of the consumer journey, the consumer heart, and taking it all the way through messaging, action, acquisition, through the full circle. So it's a huge, huge role and only growing.
Great. It's hugely empowering as a media leader to have a CMO that believes in the power of media in that way. It makes your life easier, presumably.
It's wonderful. It's it's not only empowering, but when there is data to back up that the strategies that you put in place are working, it's wonderful. It builds your brand. It talks to growth, and it just takes it to the next level.
Well, that's a good place to. We're at times. What a beautiful ending that is. Thank you, Julie. Listen, I think people are going to find this really interesting. It's David and I say privately. I don't know if we say on the show, but sometimes it's good when you get a grown up in the room, and somebody with real grown up attitude to leadership, which is really just a very kind of humanized view, and I love the way that you have always articulated that. So thank you for sharing it. Some really good key things that stood out for me was your idea of, starting with this bit of internal self-reflection, like understand how you want to operate. And then that leads you to come up with the right answer in how you want to work with agencies and what agency resources that you need. You touched on the importance of culture internally and also with agencies and we didn't dig into this, maybe actually we should probably touch on it a little bit, is that rightly the question of culture is becoming much more to the front, not just in terms of the feel of the brand, but also diversity of the workforce in any partner that you're working with as marketers. Do you want to just touch on that? Because I know that's again another kind of passion point for you before we wrap up. Because how have you seen that evolve, and how have you been involved in that this year?
It's very difficult for me to talk about. It is quite a passion point because it's personal. Being Chinese and American in an advertising agency environment has not always been easy. And I could talk to you for days of different experiences that have happened to me, both positive and negative. I think that everybody comes to advertising for a love of it, but brings a different point of view. And when different point of views clash, it's awful. When different point of views come together to rise above all of the craziness that can happen, it's wonderful. And there's been a lot of discussion in the advertising industry about diversity or lack of diversity, and whether having a chief diversity officer really works or is a figurehead. And I think there's a million philosophies, a million points of view. We could debate this forever. But at the end of the day, it goes back to what you said in the beginning: trust and credibility and respect for humans, respect for one another, respect for one another's opinion. And especially in a world where we talk so much about creativity, where some of our ideas can be subjective, it's important for minorities, Asians, people of all walks of life to really push hard and make sure your voice is heard, because it's important. So I could talk to you about this for hours. Again, it's a passion point of mine, but I just wanted to leave you with that message, because as someone who's grown up in this industry and loves this industry so much, we're having a tough time, and we need to come together on this and use forums like this to discuss. Yeah,
that's beautiful. Thank you. We've got a colleague of yours coming on the show in a few weeks, Jerry Dakin, who's also GSK, to talk a little bit more in those kind of areas about diversity and respect. We might maybe ask you to step in again and contribute to that one if you've got 10 minutes on a Friday. Listen, that was so good. Thank you. Very helpful. The overriding takeout for me is good behavior gets results. We just got to treat each other like humans, haven't we? And build that trust and credibility and respect. I love it.
Well done.
Julie, thank you so much for sharing that. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. What a star.
Good stuff. Well, yet again, another masterclass in how to be, how to be a marketer. We should have these up and sell them, really, shouldn't we? Anyway. Thank you so much, Julie, for the wise words, and
really
thank you for the comments. We didn't get to some of the questions, but appreciate that your contribution to the show. That's it for this week. We live stream every Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern. 4 p.m. UK, except next week, because I don't know if it's going to be 11 a.m. or 4 p.m. because we've got that weird time zone week thing in America. Anyway, well, I'm sure we'll let you know. But anyway, have a good week. See you next time.
Bye for now.